Capitalism is a mode of producing things.
Hmm.
Markets are a way of exchanging things. Capitalism, slavery, and serfdom, feudalism, are ways of organizing human labor until the year 1861, and a gentleman called Abraham Lincoln, who was buddy with Karl Heinrich Marx from Germany. They exchanged letters, came up with the naughty idea: how about abolishing slavery? In the Marxian economic framework, democracy means the extension of sovereignty and freedom, or democracy to the extension of the workplace.
Hello, friends. Welcome to Fiscal Focus on DawnNews English. This is Danish Khan, and today I'm joined by Shahram Azhar. He's Associate Professor of Economics at Bucknell University. And today we're going to talk about all things about economic system and economic system's relationship with democracy. As you all heard that there's a backsliding of democracy all over the world. So there's a lot of talk about it, but less has been said about the relationship between democracy and economic system. So Shahram thinks about these issues and has written about it. So I want to pose this question to you. Do you see any relationship between the backsliding of democracy and the prevailing economic system?
Well, firstly, Danish, thank you once again for inviting me. And it's always an honor and a privilege having this conversation with a fellow traveler. Um, you've raised an amazing point, and this entire conversation, obviously, is about a very, very critical issue. Um, because when we think about democracy, typically, as laypersons, we're typically thinking of the political system. And within the political system, we're thinking of a very narrow set of things like elections, political parties, and that kind of stuff, which is fair, which is obviously the concrete manifestation and the direct interaction that that most people have with the democratic process. But I want your audiences to think about this issue and worry about it as I do, and as many of my friends do who do research about this particular issue. Um, Take a moment to consider the meaning of the term democracy. Hmm?
Hmm.
What does it mean? Is it just about holding regular elections, or forming political parties, which is certainly a part of this? It can be a subset of the discussion. But what really do we mean by the term, right? As far as I understand it, the word democracy is tied with the notion of freedom and sovereignty. Hmm? In other words, if there is no freedom and sovereignty at the level of the individual, and at the level of countries, and at the level of communities, and at the level of my identity as a worker, that is to say, democracy refers to a system of organizing laws, rules, customs, cultural institutions, social institutions, etc., in which the person who is going to be governed by the laws, rules, customs, etc., should have, must have a say in determining those rules that are going to govern my life, right?
Nice. Yes.
So, in other words, freedom and sovereignty is tied with the notion of democracy. Otherwise, any attempt to disconnect or sever democracy from its essence, in my view, is an attempt at basically empty phrase mongering. Now, to specifically think about, so in other words, democracy is always going to have a cultural element, a political element, and an economic element,
Hmm.
right? It follows from this that, just as, for example, we cannot argue that a society in which the culture and history of Black people is an optional elective, and the culture and history of the white settler is considered compulsory history. Such a world obviously is oblivious to the cultural diversity, and we cannot say that such a system is culturally democratic.
Mhm.
Okay. Now let's think specifically about your question that deals with economics. And now economics, obviously, as we know from Amartya Sen, is tied with the conception of freedom. In fact, Amartya Sen wrote an entire book about this, which is considered the Bible of development economics in many circles. He won the Nobel Prize for it, so it must have been good, right? But to cut a long story short, he argues that the word development means freedom. Development is freedom. Development is the expansion of human freedoms.
Mhm.
And few human freedoms, broadly speaking, can be classified into political freedoms and economic freedoms,
Mhm.
right? Now, think about this issue in that precise sense. In the Marxian economic framework, democracy means the extension of sovereignty and freedom, or democracy to the extension of the workplace, the enterprise. What do we mean? So, for example, Monday to Friday, 9 to 5, typically, sometimes more or sometimes less, depending on the line of industry, etc. We spend a large part of our lives working at a firm or an office or a retail store or a farm, uh,
Mhm.
some enterprise, some site, some location. Now we can even work from home, obviously. But my point being that there is a certain time of the day, 8 to 10 hours, which is a significant amount of time. You spend a large part of your awake hours at this place. Now, I want your audiences to think about the following question. Is it conceivable? Is it possible, given what I said about democracy, that it's about being governed by rules that you have a say in determining? Is it possible to have a democratic social system in which the site of work, the place where you're going to spend 8 to 10 hours a day, is undemocratic? That
Mhm.
is to say, we've accepted intellectually the idea that the sphere of democracy ends at the door of the workplace, the office. In that particular environment, there is a boss
Mhm.
who is basically very similar to a dictator of the past, for example, right? There you cede all the democracy that you had in the constitution to the will of that particular individual. That individual is now going to determine how the capacity of your nerves and muscles is going to be utilized and deployed, right? And should you fail to follow that particular command without questioning, if you fail to follow that particular command, there is a penalty attached to that particular choice.
Mhm.
And we have a fancy name for it in economics. It's called unemployment.
Mhm.
So, in other words, we cannot have an economic system that is fundamentally undemocratic in the sense that the conditions of work, the conditions of employment are controlled by a handful of individuals who will decide whether or not there will be food on my table in the evening. So, the idea of democracy and capitalism seem
Mhm.
to be fundamentally opposed to one another.
So I found two interesting things in your remarks. So I want to discuss those 2 points further. First, you emphasize the significance of political freedoms. And this is in sharp contrast to classical Marxian left thinking, or at least 20th century thinking, which argued that everything is about economic freedom and the rest is superstructure. So, are you saying something similar or different here? And the second point you said at workplace, it's like a authoritarian relationship. So are you saying all forms of hierarchy are problematic, or is there something deeper about this relationship? Because from a liberal perspective, one can argue you have a choice to become an employer eventually, right? The famous thing, the American dream, everyone can be a business owner, right? So how would you respond to these 2 points?
Yeah. So, there's two distinct issues here. Huh?
Hmm.
let's deal with, and they're both thematics, if you like. The first one deals with the issue of political freedoms, hmm, and I'm going to define that term in a moment, and specifically whether or not and to what extent those ideals were um, those ideals became a matter of practice in the USSR and later China, etc. Hmm? Okay, so let's deal with each one of them separately. The first deals with the issue of political freedom, right? As you know, Marx and Engels devoted their lives to this precise question, right? That is to say, Marx is, if you study his life, for example, he was born in Germany and then he became a radical and a rebel in 1848, right? And because there was a wave of revolutions all across Europe. By the way, the political freedoms that people in Europe today take for granted are the result of the revolutions of 1848. And I invite your audiences to look up the term the Renaissance of the people or the revolutions of 1848. Hmm? Um, Now, the point being that political freedoms have been central to Marx's concern vis-a-vis political economy. Remember that he comes to England as an exile and he discovers that the ideals of liberty, equality, and fraternity that he had been mesmerized by as a young man had not been fulfilled in practice. Hmm? So Marx looks at the world capitalist system and comes to the conclusion that this is the opposite of freedom and the opposite of equality and the opposite of liberty, right? So the idea that I'm proposing is not a unique idea. It's not my conjecture or some kind of um, my innovation. I wish it were, but I can't take credit for things that have been discovered or thought about by other thinkers. So I'm just being intellectually honest in saying that Marx is the person who came up with this idea, and others alongside him and with him and before him as well. Now let's deal with the issue of the USSR. We must as social scientifically inclined people, whenever there is an experiment, we always look at the results and we weigh the pros, what people got right, and the cons, what people got wrong. Now, let's not just be critical. Let's just begin with the pros first. Of course, the kinds of economic growth rates and development that the USSR has achieved in economic history is only paralleled by one other country in economic history, the People's Republic of China, right? And there's another country on the world map that's pursuing the same path now. It's called Vietnam. If you look at this pattern, USSR, People's Republic of China, Vietnam, and if I try to classify them into one particular category, that is to say, which school of thought, broadly defined, obviously people disagree in every field, but broadly speaking, which school of political economy were these countries inspired by? And the answer is as clear as daylight. They were inspired by Marxian political economy and its approach to economics and economic development, right? Let's be clear about that. Having said that, both because of concrete set of reasons as well as because of intellectual blind spots, a number of concrete issues arose in this context. So, for example, let's talk about the USSR. The revolution of 1917 took place in October of 1917. And for the next 6 years, there was a civil war in Russia, which destroyed the productive forces to a level that it pushed Russia back to levels of 1860 in terms of industrial output per capita. Consider this fact. The armies of 17 different imperialist countries united and formed the White Army. Wait for it. It was appropriately named as the White Army. And the group of workers, peasants who had made the revolution, women who had been oppressed by the Tsarist regime, formed a coalition, and there was a civil war in Russia as a result of this, a revolution after the revolution. Now, people in Pakistan and India have lived through conflict uh, for a number of decades. We know there that in times of conflict, it's not ideal, it's not beautiful, it's not the best thing in the world, but in times of it's like an emergency. Like, I'm not defending it, but I'm just trying to point out as a social and economic historian that we must be fair in our analysis, right? Hindsight is 2020. Now, what I'm trying to argue then is that due to a host of reasons, political freedoms took a backseat in USSR as well as China, despite it being an ideal. But those freedoms have yet to, or have not been, achieved at the same scale. Political freedoms, economic freedoms, we already know, right? So, on the one hand, this position that I'm presenting is a critique of orthodox Marxism or Soviet styled Marxism for various reasons. But in one sense, it's a return to the original ideas that were first laid down by the democratic socialist thinkers of the 19th century. Coming to your second concern, which deals with this issue of choice, because when I first started studying economics as an A-level student, I learned that capitalism is a fundamentally fair economic system. And the reasoning goes along the following lines. Look, it's perfectly legal for any factor of production, pay attention to the language, of course, land, labor, or capital, right, are all factors of production. So they're all the same. Production is basically about inputs going in to a black box and stuff coming out, right? So all the interesting stuff has been assumed out already, right? Now, here's the reality. Now, a naive view could be that what's stopping the worker from becoming a capitalist or hiring other people, right? Is there any legal provision that prohibits that particular thing? Well, there's nothing legally prohibiting workers, obviously. But here's the point. How are you going to get the initial capital to set up the plant, the fixed capital, the variable capital, the raw material, the equipment, the building, the blah, blah, blah? How are you going to do that? Okay, well, you could respond by saying that we could get a loan, right? And here's a fun fact: 55% of American households are credit constrained. That is to say, their credit score sucks. That's the technical term my professor Richard Wolff uses in this particular context. Their credit score sucks, and as a result, they do not have access to the funds that are needed to initiate capitalist production. Number one. Number two, typically people who set up businesses and hire other people in doing so have the capacity to wait for a number of years before the business will become profitable.
Yeah.
In business terminology, this is known as the cash burn rate. Look it up on Investopedia. This is known as the cash burn period or the cash burn rate, in which the firm, because remember, profitability is never guaranteed. It's always a probabilistic event. There is a probability that the invested capital is going to turn to shit, right? But now here's the point, right? You must have in that interim period, 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, when you're setting up one business and then the other one fails and then you set up a third one, etc., etc. You must have access to a subsistence bundle. That is to say, you need to eat, drink, have shelter, clothing, live a decent life as a human being in this rather, unfair world, right? It would be difficult given that a universal basic income has not been guaranteed, and the alternative, if the business should fail, which many businesses do, especially if you don't have unlimited flows flowing in, right? It's highly unlikely that, I mean, how many friends do you and I know who set up franchises in Canada or the US with where the operating margin may be positive, but the net profit is -8% after you pay the Uber and you pay the government and all the rest of it, right? Yeah. And as a result, many of our friends are credit constrained, and as a result, their businesses become delinquent, right? So because of these two reasons, number one, you must have access to a subsistence
Mm,
bundle during the period in which you're setting up businesses, right? That is to say, another less nerdy way of saying it is that you must have the facility of staying out of the job market.
mm,
Because the assumption is that if I myself have to feed myself, let alone having a set of dependents, which typically young people in India and Pakistan do by the time they're in their 20s or their 30s, that's the expectation, right? The typical South Asian family is going to say, "Hun saari zindagi padh de rehna hai." You know, you understand what I'm saying?
yeah.
So the point being that a most people in humanity, 99.9% of human beings have not been born in asset rich families. How do I know that? Well, the existence of asset wealth in the hands of the few logically implies its non-existence in the hands of the many. This is just a logical fact of life, right? The fact that it exists and is concentrated in fewer hands implies that the latter has little or no bargaining power. Third and finally, the reason why this choice argument breaks down, that why don't just workers set up, you must also appreciate the fact that in addition to spending money on production, a large part of the capital has to be spent on retailing the product,
Mm,
right? Now, because of these three reasons, production, retail, and then access to a subsistence bundle during the interim period, during the cash burn period, workers within capitalist society have, are there cooperatives, by the way, within capitalist society? Yes. Workers have done that despite all of these challenges. There is a corporation, it's the sixth largest corporation in Spain. It's called Mondragon Cooperatives. It has over 80,000 workers, 800,000 workers, blah, blah, blah. Look it up. Amul in India is another example of a amazing workers cooperative. So can it be done? Yes, but there are constraints. By so what am I trying to say? I'm trying to argue that workers self-directed enterprises,
mhm.
where you replace the board of directors of the current corporation, which is premised on shareholders ownership,
Yeah.
you replace that with a workers board of directors, and you can even list it on the stock market to raise the capital and all the rest of it. But just as industrial policy in capitalist society right now promotes this or that line of business, the Reliance Group is subsidized heavily, the Tata Group is subsidized heavily in India, right? I can name industries in Pakistan which receive ridiculous amounts of subsidies. For example, the fertilizer sector, right?
Yes.
In other words, if there is a will in every capitalist society without exception, there is this thing called industrial policy, which deals precisely with this question: how are we going to support this enterprise or this line of business or that line of business, depending on our ideological, legal, political, cultural, and economic concerns. Every society does that.
No, great points, and even to further substantiate uh, one of your points is about the concentration of capital, right? And I think Marx talked about it that without strong regulation, if we leave it to market, there's an inherent tendency of concentration of capital, and that's what we have seen at the global scale. Now we have these globalized firms or multinational who control all the major markets. For instance, let's say think about the advertising sector, right? So it used to be a segmented, geographically placed sector. In local newspaper, right? You have to sell car, you put ad in the newspaper. So it's a small scale industry. Now there are only two players, YouTube and Google, right? So it's a concentration of capital. And same with like cash burn point you made about Amazon has been burning cash for decades. So that's why these new kinds of mega corporations are unique, and those 20th century antitrust policies might not be useful because there the complaint was these big corporations jack up prices. Now, there's no like folks are not upset that Walmart is expensive or Amazon is expensive because like you said, they are burning cash, they have unlimited access to credit. So it's traditional antitrust policies wouldn't work, and we would need some radical rethinking, which you are saying. And a related point about, and this is interesting because you said there must be some guarantee of basic subsistence bundle. In other words, in more popular terms, some sort of a social welfare. And surprisingly, Sweden has a higher rate of per capita startup than United States of America, right? So again, because they have much higher level of social safety nets. Of course, there are a lot of problems in Sweden as well. But coming back to now, circling it back to that question of individual freedom, because what folks who haven't read Marx, especially the primary source like Marx's Capital or other writings, they think he has no conception of individual freedom. In fact, he is probably against individual freedoms, right? And he's thinking only in terms of collective. But here you're implying that individual freedom is as important for Marx, if not the central thing.
Absolutely. Individual freedom and maximizing the freedoms of individuals is the premise, is the reason, is the, I'm going to use a French word, the raison d'etre, the reason for, the motivation for, the adarsh in Hindi, the purpose, the vision for which Marx and Marxists have been striving, right? With some success and some failure. But if we are serious about developing a progressive, pro humanitarian, progressive version of society, social laws, rules, and economic customs, and all the rest of it, we have to take the man very, very seriously. For your audiences, Danish, in every country of the world between the year 1944, the end of World War II, and 1991, there was a period of paranoia, and Pakistanis have experienced it, Indians have experienced it, every country in the world has experienced, including Western countries, a paranoia about Marx and Marxism. And particularly in economic circles, by the way, this was not true prior to the 1940s because the Department of Economics at Cambridge University, for example, was led by Piero Sciarra, Joan Robinson, and a bunch of other Gramscian and Marxist thinkers, right? The University of Harvard, for example, where Schumpeter's student, Paul Baran and Paul Sweezy, later Richard Wolff at MIT, Stephen Resnick at UC Berkeley, David Kotz, right? So in other words, Marxism was not peripheral to the analysis, but rather central to anyone who was serious about interpreting the world, right? Um, and rather, it was because of an ideological warfare against critical approaches to capitalism that these intellectual giants were systematically and methodically purged from the mainstream of the discipline. I want your audiences to look up the words 1974 Harvard Crimson, Samuel Bowles, Hardly a Surprise. I'll repeat it. The article is called Hardly a Surprise, written by your and my one of our favorite professors, Professor Samuel Bowles, who was alongside Herbert Gentis, one of the founders of evolutionary game theory, right, at the University of Harvard, and they were purged for reasons that are specified at length by Samuel Bowles in that particular article, which deals with this particular question. Now, the issue deals with the specific aspect, the issue of concentration of wealth and its implication for democracy. Firstly, Danish, let's just be, we don't need an advanced degree in economics to realize that human innovation and human thought and imagination and creativity, think of yourself and your own life as a child growing up or as a person today. When are you at your innovative peak? I'm a musician as well, right? So I'm at my intellectual or creative peak when I'm relaxed, right? when the burdens of when am I going to pay the bill, how am I going to buy the next bag of rice, etc. I've lived with that particular anxiety as well at one point in my life, so I have a clue, I have some understanding of it, both because of my friends, etc., and the circles that I've been working with. So, what I'm trying to say is that look at the neuroscience about this. Human innovation and creativity is intricately tied with our mental and intellectual and internal spiritual meditative state.
Mm.
Right? This is
Yeah.
the neuroscience. Ask any neuroscientist. I didn't make
Yes.
it up. So I'm just going to take the neuroscientist's view as a given, right? And as you rightly pointed out, within capitalist society, the democratic, socialist, or social democratic, whatever you want to call it, vision in Scandinavia, Sweden being a good example, has demonstrated this point beyond reasonable doubt that the per capita patent filing in
Mm.
Sweden, for example, compare it with other OECD countries, and you'll see what I'm talking about,
Mm-hmm.
right? Now, the second issue deals with concentration. Now, for your audiences, because this is a matter of great confusion, we must distinguish between the terms market economy and capitalism.
Okay.
While they may sound identical to some people, both on the left and the right, we must be clear that anyone who is a student of Marx's Capital should know with perfect clarity that the market system has predated capitalism by thousands of years. The first, what is a market? A market is a place where people exchange things in a quid pro quo arrangement. I give you bread, you give me shoes. I give you 5 rupees, you part with your bag of Doritos. Hmm?
Mm.
That's a market exchange. It's just a way of exchanging things which have, here's the punchline, equal value contained in them. It's an equal exchange. I gave you something that had 5 hours worth of labor or 5 rupees, and you gave me something that had 5 hours worth of labor, or I don't know, some other currency of equal 3 Indian rupees, right? This is an equal exchange. This is what a market is. Capitalism is a mode of producing things.
Mm.
Markets are a way of exchanging things. Capitalism, slavery, and serfdom, feudalism, are ways of organizing human labor. Hmm? They're
Yes.
not ways of exchanging or selling things. That's what the market is,
Mm-hmm.
but rather ways of making things. What does that mean? For example, let's consider I don't know, I'm feeling hungry, so pizza. Hmm? Let's say a pizza restaurant or a place that produces pizzas, right? And let's say our friend Kamal, who I don't know, I just didn't came up with that name, uh, is busy baking the pizzas, right? And we observe, you and I, as good social scientists, observe that Kamal bakes only eats one of the pizzas that he bakes every day. Literally,
Mm-hmm.
we were looking at him, and he's baking 20 pizzas every day, and he only consumes one of them. Now, you and I, being sensible individuals, ask him the following question: you only eat one of them. Why do you make more than what you consume? Hmm? And at this point, we can get one of four answers from Kamal. Answer one could be, hey, Danish, you see that person with the big mustache, that angry looking fellow? You're like, yeah. You're like, he's my slave master.
Mm.
And I eat one of them, and then he eats or gives out the remainder to his other slave master friends. This mode of producing things is called slavery.
Mm-hmm.
Let's do another one. Kamal says that this individual does not own my body, hence I'm not his slave, but he controls my mobility. I can't resign.
Mm.
Kamal is a serf. This is the mode of production called feudalism. Let's do another one. Kamal now says, I'm neither a slave nor is my mobility restricted. I can resign whenever I want and choose the lovely little option of starving myself and my kids to death. That's the option available. And in return for that particular service, this particular gentleman with the mustache pays me a wage, right? In other words, wage labor is the premise of capitalist production. Slave labor is the premise of slave production. Serfdom is the premise of feudal production. And let's do the final one. Now, let's say that Kamal points out that he and his five other friends, best friends, get together and as a community decide that Kamal bakes the pizzas, Jamal makes the shirts, and Aslam makes the socks, and each one of us as a community decide what to do with what has been produced. This sounds like democracy to me.
Mhm. Nice. And actually, surprisingly, this last arrangement is not that new in some ways. Historically, it has existed. Even you go to communities across the world, people do live in a way what we call these communitarian ties, where people collectively engage in labor and they collectively distribute goods and
Sorry,
services.
I'm sorry, but just to intervene, look up the science on this, right? We've been on this planet for about 250 to 300,000 years. That's what the anthropologists and the archaeologists and the people who do this kind of lovely stuff have told us. So let's take that fact as a given and ask the next question. For how many years out of this 300,000 year existence have we had community based systems? The answer is 98% of the human history that we've looked at is premised on that. I'm still here, Charlie. You're still here. That means that a community based system can and has worked and is perhaps more natural to our
Mhm.
evolutionary instincts than the systems that arose 10,000 years ago, right? They're old as well. I accept it, but they're
Yes.
not as old as 300,000 years, right? In the axial age, in 10,000 BC, roughly, a new way of organizing labor arose because of historical circumstances, is which gave birth to slavery and serfdom, and in 1800s, 1700s, this contemporary way of organizing labor according to wage labor premises, right? So this community, like you said, community-based systems have existed and still exist, by the way. Thankfully, unlike Western societies where these community systems have been completely obliterated by capitalist society, in India and Pakistan, still to some extent, our communities are a way of ensuring that people get to eat, people get to drink, because capitalism doesn't generate jobs for them. How do you
Yeah.
think people are surviving, right?
Yes.
It's because of community-based systems that we're still alive
Yeah.
despite the lack of any social security.
Yes, and an interesting point that I noticed, and throughout your discussion so far, you haven't brought up the term state in a way. And what the common perception is that anything which is non-capitalist in contemporary times, such as whatever term we use, socialism, let's say, it's all about state control. But based on your definition, if I replace an employer who owns that place, right? So somebody who privately owns that business with somebody who claims that they're a state bureaucrat. For the purpose of process, it's the same thing, right? It's the same thing. So, and another critique is, which I think is a valid point about, especially the post-colonial context where the historically left argues in favor of everything given in the control of state, but state itself is not decolonized, right? So how do you see this? Because we have been fed this binary of market versus state and think progressive left politics in terms of in favor of state, whereas pro-capitalist about market.
Absolutely. I mean, think about it this way, right? What is socialism? Socialism is the opposite of capitalism, right? Okay, now I've delayed the definition, basically. I've delayed it to the meaning of the term capitalism. Now, it follows then, logically speaking, for any student of Aristotelian logic, this is elementary, uh, the manner in which I'm going to define capitalism, my definition of socialism is going to be a derivative of that, because socialism is, to be poetic about it, capitalism's shadow, right? It's the other of of capitalism. Okay. So now, if you look at the, broadly speaking, the literature, there are non-Marxian ways of defining capitalism, because remember, just as in every word in human society, people don't mean the same thing from the same phonetics.
Yes.
Everyone has different, we might use the same words, like for example, you and I had that amazing moment where I learned that in that our Kashmiri brothers and sisters refer to the same color, hara or nila, in the opposite way, right? And it was a moment of discovery where you and I were like, yeah, hara and nila and hara and nila, now similarly, as in human language, economists, thinkers also don't use the same word, which is, they're right, by the way. So we must, so what can we do then? We will spend some time just trying to figure out, what do you mean by this and what do I mean by this, so that we can have a conversation, right? So capitalism can be defined in three ways. There's the non-Marx, these are all non-Marxist ways, and I'll define it in at the end in the manner in which Marx's Capital has defined it, because he wrote 3 volumes about that particular book. So the first way is to define capitalism as a market economy. The opposite is planned economy, right? So we defined capitalism incorrectly as a market economy, and our definition of socialism, which is its opposite, is non-market economy. Right? This is a non-Marxist way of thinking about it. Number one. Number two, capitalism is a system of risk-taking. Okay? Socializing the risk is the alternative. That's another way of defining it. Capitalism is a system of inequality. Okay? What should be socialism should be about? Equality. These are all non-Marxist ways of defining the term. We can do, there's tons of them, right? It's either, it's about the market, or it's about some kind of distribution concern, right? Or let's do the final one, government versus the private sector. Right? Capitalism is a system in which private enterprise does things. Its opposite is the government does everything, right? Now, these are all I want to emphasize again, because I don't want to lose my audiences. And what I said, these are non Marxist ways of thinking about capitalism and hence socialism. Now let's do the Marxian way of thinking about it. Marx says, as I pointed out a few moments ago, that capitalism is a way of organizing human production such that the people who make the product, aka the productive workers, do not make decisions about the surplus or the profit that has resulted from their collective labor. Let me do it again. Capitalism is an economic system in which the workers who make the stuff that the capitalist is going to sell in the market and make a profit, these workers, the community of workers, receive a wage at the end of the month for receiving this, for doing this particular thing. Okay? Now and a board of directors, of shareholders who own the stocks of the company, make decisions about the profits. So what is socialism then? Socialism now, with this definition, would be a system in which that activity of making decisions about the profits, what to do with them, how much to reinvest, how much to take home as workers, how much to distribute for children's education, how much to give to the government for healthcare. All these distributions, these decisions are no longer in the hands of an unelected, non-democratic group of shareholders sitting in Fiji Islands, sipping their cup of coffee, but rather a group of individuals who actually know about the process of production and selling and everything intricately. Guess why? Why? Because they spend 8 hours every day doing it. So socialism, then, you can call it whatever you want. You can call it green bananas. I don't care. As long as green bananas refers to an economic system in which the community of workers themselves make decisions about that which they have produced, aka economic democracy.
Nice, nice. I love this term economic democracy, right? Because then you invite everyone and you sh you go beyond their preconceived biases by invoking terms which so far hasn't been negatively understood across political and ideological lines. Now, in the interest of time, I mean, I want to come to our last question, and that is, we live in 20 right now, it's we are in 2025, and the biggest buzzword is the artificial intelligence. And there's a lot of concern about it that, oh, it might really take us to the next level in terms of productivity, or there might be a doomsday that is everybody loses their job and these billionaires and tech bros just control everything. And tied to it also the climate change, another major catastrophe. So how this division of capitalism versus socialism debate ties to these two issues, because now then we're talking about everyone, not just workers per se.
Okay, so in order to look at the question of artificial intelligence, which is the latest uh, development in the world of technology, right? We have to first think about the notion of technology in general, right? Now, seen from what is technology? What does it do? If you really had to define it from someone, if someone from Jupiter came to planet Earth and asked you, what does this term mean? You're going to basically say that it's something that increases how much we can produce for the same amount of work or the same amount of labor, right? So it's, in other words, it's something that eases human labor,
Mhm.
right? Or has the potential to make my life easier, right? Such that, for example, I can do the same amount or even more work in the same amount of time, so that I can devote that time, because ultimately, whatever we're thinking about is human life, which is measured in time,
Mhm.
right? So it's all about the allotment, the distribution of human time and human life to different arenas, right? Okay. Now, for example, when people discovered the wheel in ancient Mesopotamia or Egypt, the labor time to transport goods went down. So technology is a part of human society, and innovation has been tied with. So I want to first eliminate the bias that only capitalism produces innovation and technology, right? The discovery of fire, the discovery of the number zero, the discovery of the binary code system, which is the premise of digital communications, etc. All of these amazing technologies that capitalism treats as if they were uh, everything that's a part of human general knowledge and intellectual development is now the private property of the top 7 companies listed on S&P 500. Right.
Mhm.
By the way, here's a fun fact: if you look at the total valuation, the total market cap of S&P 500 right now, the top 7 companies own 60 to 70% of the valuation. The
Wow.
last, the bottom 490 are basically just laggers. There's no valuation growth at all, right? So all the growth is consolidated in fewer and fewer and fewer
Mhm.
hands, right? Now, let's think about this question of AI with that in mind. AI, like technological developments before it, has enormous potential to ease human life. For example, it's possible that a partly self driven car can make the life of a truckster easier, right?
Right.
Such that the truckster can make the same amount of value now, instead of working for 5 days or 6 days a week and then suffering from diabetes and all kinds of mental and physical health issues. Ethical human society would come up with the following logical and rational idea: how about we reduce the work week from 5 to 3 days?
Mhm.
Because remember, The 8-hour working day came about in 1886.
Mm.
It's been more than 140 years since that event took place. So, how about reducing the number of hours spent at the workplace from 8 to 4 hours and going in with a 3 day working week? Guess what? Finland has experimented with a 4 day work week, and the results have been stupendous, amazing. Their Finnish workers are now producing more stuff in 4 days than they were producing in 5 days, right? So, in terms of what technology should be doing always, right, is to improve the quality of the lives of the workers who make the stuff, and B,
Yes.
improving the quality of the products that the consumers consume. That's what makes rational sense to me. The aim of technology should not be that a bunch of techno feudals control, appropriate all the general knowledge that has been produced by humanity since time immemorial to the present, colonizing that knowledge, converting it into prompts, and then displaying them as if this is the product of Bing or OpenAI
Hmm.
or any of these companies, right? Now, so what am I trying to say? I'm trying to argue that unlike some of our friends who are critical of technology,
Hmm.
who take a position that others have taken in the past who were called the Luddites
Hmm.
in political economy, right? These people hated technology in general. I can empathize with their views, but there's a scientifically inclined view here, which is to say that the problem is not with the machine, but
Yeah.
rather with the relations of production that constrain the development of what has been made possible by technology. So
Yes.
I love technology. I think technology is amazing. Technology should progress and will progress regardless of whether capitalism exists or not. Or rather, I would argue, I would take it one step forward. I would say that why are we even is it true that jobs will be lost? Absolutely. Whenever technology improves, in capitalism. This is true since 1850 when the Luddites were talking about the stuff that they were doing.
Hmm.
This has been a trend since day one, right? Technology replaces human labor, and leads to unemployment,
Mm.
right? But unemployment is not a natural condition. Unemployment exists because some people decide and tell you one day that you've been fired. If some individuals have, for example, it was legal to own slaves, and hence the stuff that happened in slavery happened. Similarly, it is legal for some people to turn around and say, you're fired. Why? Because this machine is going to replace you. You don't need 20 finance analysts now. You need only one who can put in the prompt. And the 19 of you can enjoy, you know?
Yeah.
This is not destiny. This
Mm.
is the result. We've accepted this particular outcome.
Yeah.
Just as people who lived in slavery accepted that outcome until the year 1861, and a gentleman called Abraham Lincoln, who was buddy with Karl Heinrich Marx from Germany, they exchanged letters, came up with the naughty idea: how about abolishing slavery?
Mm. Yes. That seems very impractical at that time.
It's always impractical because
And
the
it's very idealistic.
it's always because you see if we were having this conversation in the year 1845, my physicist friends over here tell me that it's possible to do this kind of neurotic envisioning, right? If we have the same conversation 200 years ago, if you and I were not slaves ourselves, given our skin colors,
Mm.
uh, if we managed to be free people and became academics and economists analyzing this particular issue in the year 1840, and we said, well, the econometrics has convincingly demonstrated that slaves experience early death and mental health, uh, you know, their hairline recedes and all kinds of issues arise as a result of um, what we've observed in the data. And let's say as economists, we love the T statistic because it's highly significant and it shows the right econometrics results, and it's published and everyone is, celebrating. Now, if I ask the following question, what's the solution? And one particular individual amongst us, let's call them a Keynesian, argues that let's tax the slave masters, right? And let's use some of that tax money to give free medicine, ointment to the slaves so that they can rub it on their backs and go to sleep at night. Option one. Then there's a neoclassical economist who says that the world is the best if you just leave it the way it is, laissez-faire, right? Option two. And then there's a crazy person called Karl Heinrich Marx, because he was around at the time. And when you ask him, what's your policy proposal here? So he goes, how about the abolition of slavery? Hmm? So that we don't have to spend the money on the ointment. We don't have to irk anyone with higher taxes, which we needed because the problem was created in the first place, right? So why do we have to first create economic poverty and misery and then solve it with taxes? Why not let the workers who make the profits themselves make decisions about the profits as private enterprises or as government-owned enterprises, whatever you like?
Mm-hmm.
But as long as workers make decisions about the surplus themselves, the taxation is not a question anymore because the workers are getting what they rightfully produced. You first stole the wealth from them and then, in a roundabout way, gave it back to them either in the form of charity or in the form of fiscal expenditures.
Yeah. That's kind of trying to build a compromise between workers and capitalists, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. No, great. Now, similarly, last question for real is the issue of climate change. And this is tied to what you earlier said, because if the goal is just to accumulate wealth and just pursue higher rate of profitability, then climate or clean environment is something that is there for me to exploit, right? If that's the way to think about it. But one can argue the how this problem can be solved in socialism, because they're also, especially in the global south, the socialist economies, what if they try to maximize advancement of productive forces and treat nature or resources in the same way? So don't we need to have that ecological lens, irrespective of which ism we try to build?
Absolutely. I mean, if there's no planet Earth, then there's no capitalist production or cooperation via workers' cooperatives.
Mm.
There's no humanity left, right? Um, that may be a good thing for the animals and the rivers, given how devastating uh, humans have been
Yes.
to human ecology. So it might be a celebration for them, but I don't feel that great about my species being obliterated. So I care about my species and I care about other species as well. But specifically, let's think about this question and connect it with what I was saying earlier. You tell me, when would you be concerned more about the impact of your productive decisions, your production and business related activities, or your economic decisions? When are you more likely to be concerned about them? Option one, you're a shareholder sitting in Fiji and Solomon Islands, right? Who's going to make decisions about the profits that result from offshoring pollution to Rawalpindi,
Mm.
Delhi, Shanghai, Sao Paulo, etc., etc. Option one. Or option two, if you're from the community that makes the product and makes decisions about the profits that result from that particular production process yourself. When are you more likely to be concerned about climate as a constraint
Mm.
rather than as a free good that capitalists can exploit the way they please? Hmm? I think logically speaking, it follows. For example, thinking about myself, I don't know, if I were part of a textile company,
Mhm.
thinking of Pakistan and Bangladesh and India, where the dye and the fabric that results from this production process is being drained into the canal or the pipe via which my 10-year-old son is going to be fed every single day. As a father or as an ethical human being in general,
Hmm.
I would find this particular thing horrifying.
Yes.
I would be like, I'm willing to take a cut in my salary. I'm willing to take a cut in production. We're going to or we're going to just try to solve this issue. Either way, we're going to find a way via which my son and other people's kids are not impacted or, or experience stunted growth as a result of the profits of H&M, Zara, etc., etc.
Hmm.
Right? So, firstly, it's about incentives. Economics is about incentives. If you create the right institutional incentives, you
Hmm.
solve the problem, right? So, neither the state in of itself nor private shareholders in of themselves are going to be interested in or incentivized by any kind of claims to ecological catastrophe in general.
Hmm.
But
Yes.
rather, history demonstrates that the people who, when I was a kid, for example, Pakistan experienced a plague uh, back in the day. Uh, and I remember, because obviously we lacked government infrastructure, etc., ordinary people, men, women, children, etc., elderly, people from every age group got together, and basically it was called Bhal Safai. Uh, and all across Pakistan for a month or two, people produced this service and resolved the issue via a all-round community effort.
Hmm.
Let's do another one. The earthquake of 2005 in Kashmir. People from all across South Asia, I would say, even
Yeah.
Cuba sent its doctors, right? So, in other words, what I'm trying to say is that problems are resolved when the political will is in unison with the outcome that we're desirous of, right?
Hmm.
So the political will has to be that climate change is real, number one. Number two, we cannot keep doing business as usual given this crisis because our generations are going to suffer as a result. Number three, this issue cannot be resolved at the level of a single nation state. As
Yeah.
we know, in India and Pakistan, what happens in Amritsar has an impact on Lahore.
Hmm.
Guess what? Climate does not respect your passports and your these little lines that you've carved on the
Hmm.
planet, right? These
Yeah.
squiggly, ugly lines that you've carved on the planet are a destructive force for the existence of the planet itself.
Yes.
It's a very serious issue. So people should think about it seriously. And I seriously believe that scholars like Jason Moore, for example,
Mm.
or people whose work needs to be translated, read widely, and taken very, very seriously, more seriously than we think.
Yes. Now, thank you for sharing this. We touched upon so many topics and it was really fun. So, thank you once again for your time. And thank you to our audience for tuning in. Until next time, this is Danish Khan signing off from Fiscal Focus.